The wagons rolled into Lyndon, Kansas on a blistering July afternoon in 1874, and everyone who watched Josephine Barrett step down from the back of her cousin's covered wagon knew she would not last a month out here. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with delicate features and hands that looked like they had never done anything more strenuous than embroidery. Her dress was proper and clean despite weeks on the trail, her blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet that somehow remained spotless while everyone else looked like they had been dragged through the prairie dust. The other women whispered behind their hands, their voices carrying on the hot Kansas wind. Too soft, too refined, too meek for this hard land. Josephine heard them, of course. She had been hearing variations of the same words since she left Philadelphia 3 months ago. Her cousin Margaret had invited her west after Josephine's father passed, leaving her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. Margaret meant well, but even she looked at Josephine with pity and doubt, as if wondering what possessed her to bring such a fragile creature to a place where the earth itself seemed determined to break you. The main street of Lyndon was little more than packed dirt flanked by wooden buildings that looked hastily thrown together. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a small church with a crooked steeple. Beyond the town stretched endless prairie grass, and in the far distance, Josephine could see the dark line of trees that marked Dragoon Creek. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and she could feel sweat beginning to gather beneath her collar. "You will stay with us until you find your footing," Margaret said, placing a hand on Josephine's shoulder. Her cousin's husband, Thomas, was already unloading their supplies, his face red from exertion and sun. They had a small homestead 3 miles outside of town, a modest house and barn that Thomas had built with his own hands. "There is work at the general store, I hear. Mrs. Hendricks needs help with inventory and serving customers." Josephine nodded, grateful for any opportunity. She had $23 to her name, everything she had managed to save before leaving Philadelphia. It would not last long. What no one in Lyndon knew, what they could not see beneath her quiet demeanor and gentle manners, was that Josephine had already survived more than most of them could imagine. She had nursed her father through 2 years of slow, agonizing death from consumption. She had sold everything of value in their home to pay for his medicine and keep food on the table. She had worked as a seamstress until her fingers bled, taking jobs no one else would take, working through the night by candlelight. And when he finally passed, when the debts came due and the landlord changed the locks, she had picked herself up and made the choice to start over rather than throw herself on the mercy of distant relatives who barely remembered her name. Meek was not the same as weak. Josephine knew that, even if no one else did. She met Isaac Xander 2 weeks after arriving in Lyndon, though she had heard about him long before she ever laid eyes on him. The mountain man who came down from the hills every few months to trade furs and supplies. The recluse who lived somewhere up near the Flint Hills, where the land grew rough and wild. The man who once killed a cougar with nothing but a hunting knife when it attacked his horse. The stories varied depending on who was telling them, but they all agreed on one thing. Isaac Xander was not a man to be trifled with. Josephine was working at Hendricks' General Store when he walked in. She was standing on a stool, reaching for a bolt of fabric on the top shelf, when the door opened and the entire atmosphere of the store seemed to change. She glanced over her shoulder and nearly lost her balance. He was enormous. Well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad he had to turn slightly to fit through the doorframe. His arms were thick with muscle, visible even beneath the rolled sleeves of his worn shirt. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was covered with a thick beard that did nothing to hide the strong line of his jaw. His eyes were a startling shade of blue-green, like river water in sunlight, and they swept the store with the careful attention of someone who was always aware of his surroundings. "Help you?" Mrs. Hendricks appeared from the back room, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a stout woman in her 50s, kind enough but prone to gossip. "Need supplies," Isaac said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, like he did not speak often. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition." Josephine climbed down from the stool, trying to be unobtrusive. She had heard enough stories about Isaac Xander to know that he preferred to be left alone. But as she moved to slip past him toward the back of the store, his gaze landed on her and held. For a moment, neither of them moved. Josephine felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something in his eyes, something that was not threat or anger, but rather a deep and searching curiosity, like he was trying to understand something he had not expected to find. "Miss Barrett," Mrs. Hendricks said, breaking the spell. "Fetch the flour from the storeroom, would you?" 2 large bags. Josephine nodded quickly and hurried to the back. The flour bags weighed nearly as much as she did, and it took all her strength to drag the first one across the floor. She was struggling to lift it when a shadow fell across her path. "Let me." Isaac was there, reaching past her to lift the bag as if it weighed nothing at all. The muscles in his arms flexed beneath his skin, and Josephine found herself staring despite herself. He carried the bag to the counter, then returned for the second without waiting to be asked. "Thank you," Josephine said quietly. He paused, looking at her again with that same intense focus. "You are new." "Yes, I arrived 2 weeks ago." "From where?" "Philadelphia." Something that might have been surprise flickered across his face. "Long way." "Yes." He studied her for another moment, and Josephine had the strangest feeling that he was seeing things about her that others missed. Then he turned back to Mrs. Hendricks and continued listing his supplies. Josephine busied herself with organizing the shelves, but she could feel his presence like heat from a fire. When he left 20 minutes later, his arms laden with packages tied securely with twine, Josephine found herself watching through the window as he loaded everything onto a massive horse that looked more like a war horse from medieval times than anything she had seen in Kansas. He moved with efficient grace despite his size, every motion purposeful and controlled. "Strange man," Mrs. Hendricks said, coming to stand beside her. "Comes down from the hills every month or two, buys what he needs and disappears again. Been doing it for 5 years now. No one knows much about him except that he keeps to himself and does not cause trouble." "What does he do up there?" Josephine asked before she could stop herself. "Traps, mostly. Hunts. Has a cabin somewhere in the Flint Hills, though no one I know has ever seen it. Some say he was a soldier before, came back from the war and could not stand being around people anymore." Mrs. Hendricks shook her head. "Sad, really. A man that strong, that capable, wasting away in the wilderness." Josephine did not think he looked like he was wasting away. He looked like he had found exactly where he belonged. She did not expect to see Isaac Xander again for months, but 3 days later he was back. He came into the store just before closing, when the afternoon sun was slanting golden through the windows and Josephine was sweeping the floor. "Forgot something," he said to Mrs. Hendricks, but his eyes went to Josephine. "What did you need?" Mrs. Hendricks asked. Isaac hesitated, and for the first time Josephine saw uncertainty cross his face. "Thread and needles. The heavy kind." Mrs. Hendricks raised an eyebrow but fetched the items without comment. Josephine continued sweeping, but she was acutely aware of Isaac's presence. When Mrs. Hendricks went to the back to find the particular type of heavy-duty needles Isaac had requested, he moved closer to Josephine. "How are you settling in?" he asked. The question surprised her. It was personal, conversational, the kind of thing neighbors asked each other but strangers did not. "Well enough, thank you. Folks treating you kindly?" Yes. It was mostly true. People were polite if distant. They still looked at her like she was a piece of fine china that might shatter at any moment. Isaac nodded slowly. "Good." He paused, then added, "This land can be hard on newcomers, harder on women." "I am stronger than I look," Josephine said, meeting his gaze directly. She was tired of everyone assuming she was helpless. Something sparked in his eyes. Not amusement exactly, but something close. Respect, maybe. "I believe you." Before she could respond, Mrs. Hendricks returned with the needles. Isaac paid and left, but Josephine felt like something had shifted between them. Some unspoken understanding had been reached. He came back the following week, and the week after that. Always with some small item he needed, always making a point to speak to Josephine, even if only for a moment. Mrs. Hendricks noticed, of course, and soon the whole town was buzzing with speculation. What interest could a man like Isaac Xander possibly have in sweet, gentle Josephine Barrett? Margaret was more direct in her concerns. "He is not the marrying kind," she warned one evening as they prepared supper. "Men like that, they are too wild, too set in their ways. Do not let your head be turned by a handsome face." "He has been nothing but courteous," Josephine replied, slicing potatoes with careful precision. "And I have no expectations." But that was not entirely true. She found herself thinking about Isaac more than she should. About the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when something amused him. About the gentleness in his huge hands when he had lifted those flour bags, careful not to let them swing anywhere near her. About the scar on his forearm that looked like it had come from something with claws. Summer deepened into August, and the heat became oppressive. The creek that ran through the Barrett homestead shrank to a trickle, and the prairie grass turned brown and brittle. Josephine worked 6 days a week at the store, saving every penny she could, dreaming of the day when she might have a small place of her own. Mrs. Hendricks was teaching her the accounts, and Josephine had a natural head for numbers that surprised them both. On a Thursday afternoon, when the store was empty and the heat made everything feel sluggish and slow, Isaac came in with blood on his shirt. Josephine was behind the counter and saw him immediately. "You are hurt." "It is nothing." But his jaw was tight with pain. "It does not look like nothing." She came around the counter, her heart pounding. "What happened?" Horse spooked. "Threw me into some rocks." He pressed a hand to his ribs, and Josephine saw him wince. Mrs. Hendricks had gone home early with a headache, leaving Josephine to close up. She made a decision in an instant. "Sit down." "Let me look." "I will be fine." "Mr. Xander, you are bleeding onto the floor. Sit down before you fall down." He blinked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. Then, slowly, he lowered himself onto the wooden bench near the door. Josephine locked the front entrance, turned the sign to closed, and went to fetch the medical supplies Mrs. Hendricks kept in the back. Her hands were steady as she returned with clean cloth, carbolic acid, and bandages. "You need to remove your shirt." Isaac hesitated, then reached back and pulled the shirt over his head in one smooth motion. Josephine had to force herself to focus on the injury and not on the expanse of muscled chest and shoulders now revealed. He had scars, old ones, white lines crisscrossing his skin like a map of past battles. But the fresh wound was on his left side, a deep gash that had soaked through his shirt. "This needs stitches," she said quietly. "You know how to do that." "I do." She had stitched her father's wounds more than once when he fell in his later days. Her hands had been steady then too. Isaac nodded. "All right." Josephine threaded a needle with steady fingers, cleaned the wound with carbolic acid that made Isaac's breath hiss between his teeth, and began to stitch. He sat perfectly still, not even flinching as the needle pierced his skin. She worked carefully, making small, even stitches the way she had been taught. "You are good at this," he said after a while, his voice strained but calm. "I had practice. My father was ill for a long time. I am sorry. Thank you." She tied off the last stitch and began wrapping clean bandages around his ribs. Her hands touched his skin, and she could feel the heat of him, the solid strength of muscle and bone. "You should rest for a few days. Those ribs might be bruised, possibly cracked. Cannot rest. Got traps to check. Then you will make it worse and take even longer to heal." She tied the bandage securely and stepped back, finally meeting his eyes. "Does anyone ever win an argument with you?" He almost smiled. "No. Then I suppose I am wasting my breath. Probably." They looked at each other, and something passed between them in the quiet of the closed store, something that made Josephine's heart beat faster and her breath come shallow. "Why do you live up there alone?" she asked before she could stop herself. "In the hills." Isaac was silent for a long moment. He reached for his ruined shirt, looked at it, then set it aside. "The war changed things. Changed me. Too much noise, too many people. It makes me feel like I am back there, in the mud and the blood and the screaming." He spoke quietly, without self-pity. "Up in the hills it is peaceful. Just me and the land and the animals. I can breathe there." Josephine nodded slowly. She understood, in a way. She had left Philadelphia not just because of money, but because every street corner held memories of loss. Every room echoed with her father's coughing. Sometimes starting over meant finding a place where the past could not follow. "I brought an extra shirt," Isaac said. "In my saddlebag. Would you mind?" Josephine retrieved it for him, and he pulled it on carefully, mindful of the fresh stitches. When he stood, he towered over her again, but somehow he did not seem threatening, just solid, real, present in a way that most people were not. "Thank you," he said. "For this." He gestured to his bandaged side. "You are welcome." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Would you like to see it? The hills," Josephine's breath caught. "What?" "The Flint Hills, where I live. It is beautiful this time of year. The grass turns gold and you can see for miles." He looked uncomfortable, like he was out of practice at making offers. "Could take you up there. Show you around. If you wanted." Every sensible part of Josephine's brain told her to say no. He was a stranger, essentially. She barely knew him. Going alone with him into the wilderness was the kind of thing that ruined reputations and worse. But there was something in his eyes, something honest and hopeful and tentative, that made her want to say yes. "When?" she asked. "Sunday, if you have the day free." "I do," he nodded, something like relief crossing his face. "I will pick you up at your cousin's place. Early morning, before it gets too hot." After he left, Josephine stood in the empty store and wondered what she had just agreed to. But she was not afraid. Somehow, she knew with absolute certainty that Isaac Xander would never hurt her. Sunday dawned clear and warm, the sky the pale blue of early morning. Josephine wore her simplest dress, sturdy boots, and a wide-brimmed hat to keep off the sun. Margaret had nearly had an apoplexy when Josephine told her about the planned outing. "Absolutely not," Margaret had said firmly. "I will not allow you to go riding off with a man you barely know. What would people say?" "I am 22 years old," Josephine had replied calmly. "I am not asking permission. I am telling you where I will be so you do not worry." They had argued for an hour, but in the end, Margaret had realized that Josephine would go regardless. Thomas had been more sanguine about the whole thing. "Xander is rough around the edges, but I have never heard a bad word about his character," he had said. "And Josephine is old enough to make her own choices." Isaac arrived just after dawn, riding his massive horse with a smaller mare trailing behind on a lead rope. The mare was a gentle-looking creature with kind eyes, and Josephine felt a rush of gratitude that he had thought to bring something appropriate for her skill level. "Morning," Isaac said, dismounting. He looked freshly washed, his hair still damp and tied back, his shirt clean. The bandage was visible beneath his shirt at his side, but he moved without obvious discomfort. "Good morning. How are your ribs healing? You did good work." He helped her onto the mare, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The contact lasted only a moment, but Josephine felt it like a brand. They rode out of the yard with Margaret watching from the doorway, her face tight with worry. Josephine did not look back. The Flint Hills rose gradually from the prairie, the land shifting from flat grassland to rolling hills covered in tall grass that whispered and swayed in the morning breeze. Isaac led them along paths that only he could see, navigating between limestone outcroppings and through creeks that ran clear over beds of smooth stone. He pointed out landmarks as they rode: a bluff where eagles nested, a meadow where wildflowers bloomed in spring, a stand of cottonwoods that turned gold in autumn. He spoke more than Josephine had ever heard him speak, and she realized that up here, away from town and people and the weight of their judgments, he was different, more relaxed. The tension that usually tightened his shoulders seemed to ease. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked as they paused to let the horses drink from a stream. 5 years. Came west after the war ended in '65, drifted for a while, ended up in Kansas. Found this place and knew I wanted to stay. "You ever get lonely?" Isaac considered the question. "Sometimes. But lonely is better than suffocating." Josephine understood that too. They rode for another hour before Isaac guided them up a steep trail that wound between rock faces. At the top, the land opened into a small valley sheltered by hills on 3 sides. A cabin sat in the center, built from logs and stone, with a covered porch and a chimney that looked solid and well made. Behind it stood a barn and a corral where 2 more horses grazed. A garden plot showed neat rows of vegetables, and chickens pecked in a fenced run. "This is your home," Josephine said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. Yes, she had expected something rough, barely more than a shelter, but this was a real homestead, carefully tended and thoughtfully arranged. "It is beautiful." Isaac dismounted and helped her down. "Built it all myself. Took the better part of 2 years. He showed her around, pointing out features with quiet pride. The cabin had 2 rooms, a main living space with a large fireplace and a smaller bedroom. The furniture was handmade but sturdy, the floor swept clean. Books lined a shelf near the fireplace, more than Josephine would have expected. The barn was well organized, tools hanging neatly on the walls, hay stacked in the loft. "You are very self-sufficient," Josephine observed. "Have to be this far out. Closest neighbor is 6 miles away." They sat on the porch while Isaac made coffee over the outdoor fire pit. The view stretched for miles, nothing but rolling hills and endless sky. The wind moved through the grass in waves, and somewhere far off a hawk cried. "I can see why you love it here," Josephine said. Isaac handed her a tin cup of coffee and settled onto the bench beside her. Not too close, respecting propriety, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Most people think I am crazy, living out here alone. Most people do not understand the difference between solitude and loneliness." He looked at her sharply. "You are not like other women. I have been told I am too meek to survive out here." "Meek?" Isaac shook his head. "They are blind. You are one of the strongest people I have ever met." Josephine felt her throat tighten. "You do not know me well enough to say that. I know you left everything you knew and came west alone. I know you took care of your father for years. I know you work 6 days a week and do not complain. I know you stitched my ribs without flinching." He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. Gentleness is not the same as weakness, Josephine. Most people never learn that. They think you have to be hard to be strong. But the strongest people I have known were gentle. They just had the courage to stay that way even when the world tried to break them. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked past her quiet demeanor and seen what lay beneath. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back. "Why did you invite me here?" she asked. Isaac's expression was serious, his eyes holding hers. "Because from the moment I saw you, I could not stop thinking about you. Because you are beautiful and kind and you do not look at me like I am a monster. Because when I am in town, the only time I can breathe easy is when I am talking to you." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Isaac, I know I am not the kind of man a woman like you should be interested in. I am rough and I live in the middle of nowhere and I do not know how to make pretty speeches. But I am honest, and I am telling you honestly that I have feelings for you, have since the first day." Josephine set her coffee cup down with trembling hands. "I have feelings for you too." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and precious. Then Isaac smiled, really smiled, and it transformed his entire face. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, and his fingers curled around hers with infinite care. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands on the porch, watching the wind move through the grass and the sun climb higher in the sky. It felt like the beginning of something momentous, like the first page of a story Josephine had not dared to hope she would get to write. Over the following weeks, Isaac came to town more frequently. Always with some excuse, some supplies he needed, but everyone knew the real reason. He would spend hours at the general store, helping Josephine with heavy lifting, talking with her during slow periods, walking her back to Margaret's homestead in the evenings. The town gossips had a field day, but to Josephine's surprise, the talk was not all negative. Isaac was well respected, even if he was considered odd, and people began to see that he treated Josephine with a respect and care that was undeniable. He never pushed her, never demanded anything, simply made it clear that he was interested and willing to wait for however long she needed. Margaret softened too, especially after Isaac came by one Sunday and spent the entire afternoon helping Thomas repair their barn roof. He worked tirelessly, his strength making short work of tasks that would have taken Thomas days to complete alone. When he stayed for supper, he was polite and courteous, answering Margaret's pointed questions with patient honesty. "What are your intentions toward my cousin?" Margaret asked bluntly over pot roast. Isaac did not hesitate. "I intend to court her properly. And if she will have me, I intend to marry her." The directness of it made Josephine blush, but Isaac met Margaret's gaze steadily. "She deserves a good life," Margaret said. "Security. A real home. I can give her that. I own my land outright, no debts. I can provide for a family. And I would spend every day of my life making sure she is happy and safe." Thomas cleared his throat. "That is good enough for me." Margaret looked between Isaac and Josephine, saw the way they looked at each other, and finally nodded. "All right then." As summer faded into autumn, Isaac took Josephine riding in the hills every Sunday. He taught her to read the land, to identify animal tracks and edible plants, to understand the rhythms of the prairie. She was a quick student, and she loved the freedom of being out in the open spaces, away from the confines of town. He showed her his traps and explained how he cured hides. She taught him about books, reading aloud to him in the evenings while he worked on repairing tack or carving wood. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing histories and dreams and fears. Josephine learned that Isaac had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 sons. He had enlisted at 17 and fought for 3 years, seeing action in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. He did not talk much about those years, but she could see the shadows in his eyes sometimes, the way he flinched at loud noises. Isaac learned that Josephine had once dreamed of being a teacher, that she loved poetry and mathematics in equal measure, that she missed the ocean even though she had only seen it twice. He learned that she sang when she thought no one was listening, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but would never admit it, that she wanted children someday but feared she might not be strong enough to survive childbirth. "You will be fine," he told her firmly when she confessed that fear one evening as they sat by the fire in his cabin. "You are stronger than you know, and I would be there, every step of the way." The way he said it, with such absolute certainty, made her believe him. By October, they were thoroughly in love. Isaac had not kissed her yet, holding to a rigid sense of propriety that Josephine found both frustrating and endearing. But the way he looked at her, the way his hand lingered at her waist when he helped her onto her horse, the way his eyes followed her whenever she moved, all of it spoke volumes. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Isaac came into town with a purpose. Josephine was restocking shelves when he entered, and she knew immediately that something was different. He was dressed more carefully than usual, his hair neatly tied back, his shirt clean and pressed. "Miss Barrett," he said formally, "might I have a word with you, Mrs.?" Hendricks looked between them and smiled knowingly. "Take your break, dear. I can manage the store." Isaac led Josephine outside to where his horse stood waiting. He had brought the gentle mare too, already saddled. "Will you ride with me? There is something I want to show you." Curious, Josephine agreed. They rode out of town toward the hills, taking a route she recognized. But instead of going to his cabin, Isaac led her to a spot she had not seen before, a high bluff that overlooked miles of rolling prairie. The autumn grass had turned golden, and the late afternoon sun painted everything in shades of amber and bronze. "This is the most beautiful place I know," Isaac said as they dismounted. "I come here when I need to think, to make important decisions." Josephine's heart began to pound. "Isaac." He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. He looked nervous, which was so unlike him that it made her want to laugh and cry at the same time. "Josephine Barrett, I am not good with fancy words, but I want you to know that you are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Before I met you, I was just existing, going through the motions, but you made me want to live again, really live." She could hardly breathe. "Isaac, I know I am not the kind of man you probably imagined marrying. I do not have much to offer except hard work and a cabin in the hills. But I love you. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see the world. I love how gentle you are, how patient. I love everything about you." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me, Josephine? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving to you how much you are loved?" Tears spilled down Josephine's cheeks. "Yes, yes, of course, yes." The relief and joy on Isaac's face was beautiful to see. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully like she was precious beyond measure. Then, finally, he kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if he was afraid of breaking her. But Josephine pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, and the kiss deepened. His arms tightened around her, and she felt the full strength of him, the solid wall of muscle and warmth. He kissed her like she was air and he had been drowning, like she was light after years of darkness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "I will take care of you, I promise. You will never want for anything." "I know," Josephine whispered. "I trust you." They were married 3 weeks later in the little church in Lyndon. It was a small ceremony, just Margaret and Thomas, Mrs. Hendricks, the preacher, and a handful of townspeople who had become friendly with Josephine over the months. Isaac wore a new shirt and pants, his hair trimmed and his beard neatly shaped. Josephine wore a simple cream dress that Margaret had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair. When Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band he had traded furs for, Josephine felt like her heart might burst from happiness. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed her in front of everyone with such tender passion that Margaret actually sighed. The townspeople threw a small celebration at the church hall, with food and music and dancing. Isaac was stiff and uncomfortable at first, unused to being the center of attention, but he relaxed when Josephine took his hand and pulled him onto the dance floor. He was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, leading her through the steps with natural rhythm. "Happy," he murmured as they swayed together. "More than I have ever been," Josephine replied honestly. They left before sunset, riding back to Isaac's cabin, their cabin now as husband and wife. The evening was cool and clear, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. When they arrived, Isaac dismounted and then lifted Josephine down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold, holding her against his chest like she weighed nothing. Inside, he had prepared. The cabin was clean, fresh flowers in a jar on the table, the fire already burning warm in the hearth. He set her down gently and stepped back, suddenly looking uncertain again. "Josephine, I want you to know that we can take this as slow as you need. I will not ever push you for anything you are not ready for." She loved him even more in that moment, for his consideration and care, but she had been ready for this, ready for him, for weeks now. "I am your wife, Isaac, and I want to be your wife in every way." His eyes darkened with heat and something deeper. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." He crossed to her in 2 long strides, cupping her face in his hands, kissing her with a hunger that made her knees weak. His hands moved to the buttons of her dress, trembling slightly, and she reached up to help him. They undressed each other slowly, learning the landscape of skin and muscle, the terrain of each other's bodies. Isaac was so careful with her, treating her like spun glass even as passion built between them. And Josephine discovered that gentleness did not mean timidity. She could be soft and still be bold, could be tender and still be passionate. That night, in the warmth of their marriage bed, with Isaac's strong arms wrapped around her and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Josephine felt like she had finally come home. The first weeks of marriage were an adjustment. Josephine had to learn the rhythms of frontier life, the constant work that came with maintaining a homestead. Isaac had to learn to share his space, to consider another person's needs and wants in his daily decisions. But they both approached it with patience and determination, and with genuine love for each other. Josephine discovered that she was stronger than she had realized. She learned to chop wood, to haul water, to tend the garden and care for the chickens and horses. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and sun-browned. Her arms developed lean muscle from carrying heavy loads, but she did not mind the changes. She felt more capable, more vital than she ever had in Philadelphia. Isaac, for his part, seemed to bloom under the influence of having Josephine in his life. He smiled more, laughed more, talked more. The shadows in his eyes receded. He taught her to shoot, spending patient hours showing her how to handle a rifle properly. "You need to be able to protect yourself when I am out checking traps," he said seriously. "I trust you to be safe." The trust was important to her. He never treated her like a fragile thing to be coddled. He taught her what she needed to know and then trusted her to do it. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with bitter winds and snow that piled in drifts against the cabin walls. They were snowed in for days at a time, but Josephine did not mind. The cabin was warm and tight. Isaac had stockpiled plenty of supplies, and she had her husband all to herself. They spent long evenings by the fire, Josephine reading aloud while Isaac worked on various projects. He was making a cradle, she realized one evening, watching his large hands move with surprising delicacy over the wood. She had not told him yet, had not been sure, but apparently he had guessed. "Isaac," she said softly, setting down her book. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw hope and question in them. "I am with child." The joy that spread across his face was like sunrise. He set down his tools and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair and placing his hand gently over her still flat belly. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "I have been sure for a few weeks now." "Why did you not tell me?" "I wanted to be certain." He kissed her, then kissed her belly through her dress. "A baby, we are having a baby. Are you happy?" Happy does not even begin to cover it. He looked up at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "I will take care of both of you, I swear it. You and our child will have everything you need." Josephine ran her fingers through his hair, love overwhelming her. "I know." The pregnancy progressed well through the winter and into spring. Josephine was sick in the mornings at first, but Isaac was attentive, bringing her tea and crackers, holding her hair when necessary, never complaining about the disruption. As her belly grew, he became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy, hovering whenever she climbed the porch steps, checking on her constantly when he had to leave for his trap lines. "I am not made of glass," she protested one morning when he insisted on carrying in all the water himself. "I know, but I am not taking chances." In May, when the prairie was covered in wildflowers and the creek ran high with snowmelt, Margaret and Thomas came to visit. Margaret had not seen Josephine since the wedding, and her eyes went wide when she saw her cousin's rounded belly. "Oh, Josephine, you look so healthy, so happy." Josephine embraced her cousin warmly. "I am, very much so." Margaret looked around the homestead with obvious surprise. The garden was flourishing, the animals were healthy and well cared for, and the cabin had been expanded with a new room that Isaac had built during the winter. "You have done so well for yourself. I was so worried when you married, but I can see now that I need not have been." Thomas and Isaac walked the property together, talking about crops and livestock while the women visited inside. Margaret peppered Josephine with questions about the baby, about life in the hills, about whether she ever missed town. "Sometimes," Josephine admitted. "But Isaac takes me into Lyndon every few weeks, and honestly, I love it here. The peace and quiet, the beauty of the land, and having Isaac all to myself without the whole town watching and gossiping. He treats you well, better than I ever dreamed." Josephine smiled. "He is the kindest man I have ever known, Margaret. Strong, yes, and capable, but so gentle with me. He never raises his voice, never loses his patience. And he works so hard to make sure we have everything we need." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "I am so glad. You deserved happiness, after everything you went through with your father." Before Margaret and Thomas left, Isaac took Thomas aside and had a quiet conversation. Josephine saw Thomas nod seriously, clap Isaac on the shoulder. Later, when she asked Isaac what they had discussed, he said, "Just asked him to be there when the baby comes. In case anything happens to me, I wanted to make sure someone would look after you and the child." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Josephine said firmly, but her heart warmed at his foresight. As summer deepened and her belly grew larger, Josephine found herself moving more slowly, tiring more easily. Isaac insisted she rest often, taking over all the heavy chores without complaint. He was building furniture for the nursery, adding to the cradle with a small dresser and a rocking chair that he carved and sanded until it was smooth as silk. One evening in late July, As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Josephine felt the baby kick hard against her ribs. She gasped and grabbed Isaac's hand, pressing it to her belly. His face lit up when he felt the movement. Strong. Just like his mother, his or her does not matter to me as long as you are both healthy. I am scared, Josephine admitted. About the birth. Isaac pulled her close as her belly would allow. I know, but I will be right there with you. And I have already asked the doctor from Lyndon to come stay for a week around your time. He owes me a favor and he agreed. Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. You think of everything. I try. The baby came on a hot August afternoon, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Josephine was hanging laundry when her water broke and the first contraction hit hard enough to double her over. Isaac was checking traps 2 miles away, but by some miracle, he chose that moment to come home early. He found her leaning against the porch rail, panting through a contraction, and his face went white. The baby, now, she gasped. He swept her up in his arms and carried her inside, settling her on the bed. The doctor, I need to ride for the doctor. No time, this baby is coming fast. Isaac looked terrified, more scared than she had ever seen him, even more than when he talked about the war. I do not know anything about delivering babies. You have helped mares foal, same principle. She tried to smile, but another contraction hit and she cried out. Isaac gripped her hand, his face set with determination. All right, we can do this. Tell me what you need. Josephine talked him through the preparations, drawing on knowledge gleaned from books and conversations with other women. Isaac followed her instructions exactly, boiling water, gathering clean cloths, washing his hands thoroughly. His own fear was evident, but he pushed it aside to focus on what needed to be done. The labor was hard and long. Josephine had never experienced pain like this, wave after wave of it, each contraction stronger than the last. But Isaac never left her side. He held her hand, let her squeeze until his bones creaked, wiped her face with cool water, murmured encouragement. You can do this. You are the strongest person I know. Just a little longer, love, just a little longer. When the urge to push came, Josephine bore down with everything she had. Isaac positioned himself to catch the baby, his hands steady despite his fear. I can see the head. You are doing so well. One more push, Josephine. One more. She pushed with all her might, and suddenly there was release and relief and the thin, angry wail of a newborn. Isaac's laugh was half-sob as he lifted the baby, a red-faced, squalling infant covered in blood and vernix. A boy, he said, his voice choked. We have a son. He placed the baby on Josephine's chest, and she wrapped trembling arms around the tiny, perfect life they had created. The baby quieted at the sound of her heartbeat, his dark blue eyes blinking up at her. Hello, little one, she whispered. Hello, my darling boy. Isaac cut and tied the cord with shaking hands, then helped with the afterbirth, cleaning Josephine and the baby with gentle efficiency. When they were both cleaned and settled, Isaac sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his wife and son like they were miracles. I have never been so scared in my life, he said hoarsely. But you did it. You were incredible. We did it, Josephine corrected. I could not have done it without you. They named him Ian Xavier, and he was perfect. Dark hair like his father, and even at just a few hours old, it was clear he had inherited Isaac's strong features. He was a hungry baby, nursing well right from the start, and Josephine marveled at the strength in his tiny hands as he gripped her finger. Isaac was besotted. He held Ian constantly, talking to him in a low, gentle voice, marveling at every small feature. Look at his hands, so tiny, and his toes. He has your nose, Josephine. He has your everything else. Good lungs, though, that is from you. They laughed together. tired and overwhelmed and happier than either had imagined possible. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings. Isaac took over all the household chores, refusing to let Josephine do anything but rest and care for Ian. He cooked, cleaned, tended the animals, and never once complained about the interrupted sleep or the crying. When Ian was 3 weeks old, they made the trip into Lyndon to show him off and have him baptized. The whole town came out to see the baby, and there was a general sense of celebration. Mrs. Hendricks cooed over Ian, declaring him the most handsome baby she had ever seen. Margaret cried happy tears, holding her new cousin-nephew with gentle awe. "You have made quite the life for yourself," Mrs. Hendricks said to Josephine as they stood in the churchyard after the baptism. "I remember when you first arrived, so quiet and unsure, and look at you now, a wife, a mother, thriving out in the hills." "I found where I belong," Josephine said simply. "That you did, dear, that you did." On the ride home, Ian slept peacefully in a sling against Josephine's chest, and Isaac rode beside them, keeping a protective eye on his family. The sun was setting over the hills, painting the grass gold and amber, and Josephine felt a swell of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "What is it?" Isaac asked immediately, noticing. "I am just happy, so deeply, completely happy." Isaac reached over and took her hand, his thumb rubbing circles on her palm. "So am I." The seasons turned and Ian grew. He was a healthy baby, hitting all his milestones right on schedule. By 6 months he was sitting up, by 9 months crawling at impressive speeds across the cabin floor. Isaac baby proofed everything, securing furniture to walls and moving anything breakable to high shelves. Josephine settled into motherhood with surprising ease. The quiet patience that people had mistaken for meekness served her well with an infant. She never lost her temper when Ian fussed, never felt overwhelmed by the constant needs. Isaac often found them together in the rocking chair, Josephine singing softly while Ian nursed or slept. Life on the homestead was full of work, but it was good work, meaningful work. Isaac expanded his trapping operation, bringing in enough income that they were able to add onto the cabin again, creating a separate bedroom for Ian. Josephine started a small egg business, selling to the general store in Lyndon. And between them, they built a comfortable, if simple, life. When Ian was a year old, walking on sturdy legs and getting into everything, Josephine realized she was pregnant again. This time she told Isaac right away, and his reaction was just as joyful as before. "Another baby," he said, sweeping her up and spinning her around despite her protests. Ian laughed and clapped his hands, not understanding but caught up in his father's excitement. "You are not worried about the money or the space. We will make it work. We always do." The second pregnancy was easier than the first. Josephine knew what to expect, and her body seemed to remember how to do this. Ian kept her busy, toddling after her everywhere, helping her with the chickens and the garden in his clumsy, enthusiastic way. Isaac doted on both of them, building Ian a small bed for when the new baby would need the cradle, teaching his son to be gentle and careful. Ian was fascinated by his mother's growing belly, patting it and babbling to it in his limited vocabulary. In early spring, just as the first wildflowers began to bloom, Josephine went into labor again. This time Isaac was prepared. He had restocked all their supplies, had the doctor on standby in town with instructions to come at the first sign, had everything organized and ready. But just like the first time, the baby came fast. Josephine's labor started at dawn, and by mid-morning she was pushing. Isaac delivered their second son with steady hands and only slightly less panic than the first time, and when he placed the baby in Josephine's arms, she saw tears streaming down his face. "Another boy," he said. Another perfect, beautiful boy. They named him James Xavier, and where Ian had been sturdy and dark-haired, James was delicate and blonde, taking after Josephine's coloring. Ian was fascinated by his baby brother, wanting to touch and hold him constantly, and Isaac supervised the interactions with careful attention, teaching Ian how to be gentle. With 2 young children, life became even busier. Isaac hired a local boy to help with some of the heavier outdoor work, so he could spend more time with his family. Josephine learned to balance the needs of 2 boys at different stages, and somehow she managed it all with the same calm grace that had always defined her. People who came to visit the homestead invariably remarked on how smoothly everything ran, how happy the family seemed. And it was true. Josephine and Isaac had built something real and lasting, a partnership based on mutual respect and deep love. The years passed in a blur of milestones and moments. Ian's first words, James learning to walk. The time Ian fell out of a tree and broke his arm, and Isaac stayed calm while Josephine panicked. The blizzard that snowed them in for 2 weeks when James was 3, and they all camped out in the main room near the fireplace, telling stories and playing games. When Ian was 5 and James was 3, Josephine discovered she was pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder, her body more tired, but Isaac was there for every moment. He took over more of the childcare, entertaining the boys while Josephine rested, cooking meals and maintaining the house with patient efficiency. Their daughter was born in autumn when the prairie grass had turned gold and the air held the first hint of winter. She came into the world screaming, pink-faced and furious, and Isaac fell in love instantly. "A girl," he breathed, cradling her tiny form. "We have a daughter." They named her Julia Xavier, and she was a perfect blend of both parents. Dark hair like Isaac, delicate features like Josephine, and a temperament that was fierce and gentle in equal measure. Her brothers adored her, Ian appointing himself her protector and James her entertainer. With 3 children, the cabin was bursting at the seams. Isaac spent the next summer building a larger addition, creating separate rooms for the boys and Julia, expanding the living space. Neighbors came to help with the big jobs, and there was a sense of community that Josephine had not expected when they first moved to the hills. She realized, watching Isaac work alongside other men, laughing and joking in a way he never could have when she first met him, that he had changed as much as she had. He was no longer the isolated mountain man who came to town only when necessary. He was a husband, a father, a respected member of the community. He had let people in, let himself be part of something larger, and she, the girl who everyone said was too meek to survive out west, had not just survived but thrived. She ran a successful homestead, raised 3 healthy children, and had built a life of purpose and meaning. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the children play in the yard. Ian was teaching James how to skip stones in the creek, while Julia toddled after butterflies with serious concentration. "About how wrong everyone was," Josephine said. "About both of us." Isaac smiled and pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her shoulders. They did not understand. "Strength comes in different forms. You taught me that. You already knew it. I just helped you see it." They watched their children until the sun set and the stars came out, until it was time to call everyone inside for supper and baths and bedtime stories. And later, when the house was quiet and the children were sleeping, Isaac and Josephine lay together in their bed, his hand resting on her hip, her head on his chest. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too. Always." The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and challenges but always anchored by the love that Isaac and Josephine shared. The children grew, healthy and strong, each developing their own personality and interests. Ian was serious and thoughtful, showing an aptitude for working with wood that made Isaac proud. James was the adventurer, always climbing trees and exploring the far reaches of their property. Julia was fierce and determined, refusing to be left behind when her brothers went on their adventures. When Ian turned 10, Isaac began teaching him more advanced skills: how to read animal tracks, how to set traps humanely, how to shoot accurately and safely. Josephine taught all three children to read and write, creating lessons at the kitchen table each morning. They had no formal school this far from town, but her children were as educated as any in Lyndon, perhaps more so. Margaret and Thomas remained close friends, visiting several times a year and hosting the growing Xavier family at their homestead in turn. Mrs. Hendricks sent packages of treats and books for the children, maintaining her affection for the gentle girl who had surprised everyone by becoming a capable frontierswoman. Isaac's nightmares about the war, which had plagued him for so long, gradually faded. Oh, he still had bad nights occasionally, waking in a cold sweat from dreams of blood and smoke. But Josephine was always there, wrapping her arms around him, grounding him in the present until the memories receded. "You saved me," he told her once, after a particularly bad episode. "Before I met you, I was just existing. You gave me a reason to live." "We saved each other," Josephine replied, and it was true. She had needed someone to see past her quiet exterior to the strength beneath. He had needed someone to see past his rough edges to the gentle heart within. When Julia was 7, a drought hit Kansas. The creek that ran through their property slowed to a trickle, and the grass turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. Isaac was worried. Josephine could see it in the tension of his shoulders and the way he watched the sky constantly, hoping for rain. They rationed water carefully, prioritizing the animals and the garden. The children did not complain, even when baths became rare, and their play was curtailed to preserve energy during the hottest parts of the day. Ian and James helped their father dig deeper into the creek bed, finding a spring that still ran clear even when everything else was dry. Josephine made meals stretch, using every bit of their supplies with creative efficiency. She had learned frugality during her father's illness, and those skills served her well now. They did not go hungry, but meals were simple and portions were smaller. The drought broke in late August with a storm that rolled across the prairie like divine intervention. The rain came down in sheets, soaking into the parched earth, filling the creek until it rushed and sang. The entire family stood on the porch and watched, Ian and James whooping with joy, Julia dancing in the rain until she was drenched and laughing. Isaac pulled Josephine close and kissed the top of her head. "We made it through. We always do." The homestead recovered quickly once the rains came. The grass greened, the garden flourished, and life returned to normal. But the experience had taught the children valuable lessons about resilience and adaptation, about not taking resources for granted. As the children grew into adolescence, new challenges arose. Ian, at 14, was almost as tall as his father and eager to take on more responsibility. James, at 12, was all restless energy and big dreams of seeing the world beyond the hills. Julia, at 9, was developing a stubborn streak that reminded everyone of both her parents. Isaac handled the teenage years with patient understanding, remembering his own youth. He gave the boys responsibilities that stretched them but did not break them, teaching them that being a man meant being reliable and honest and hardworking. He taught Julia that she could be just as capable as her brothers, that gentleness and strength were not mutually exclusive. Josephine watched her husband with their children and fell in love with him all over again. He was such a good father, patient and firm in equal measure, always making time to listen to their problems and celebrate their victories. When Ian was 16, he began courting a girl from town, the daughter of the blacksmith. Isaac and Josephine watched with amusement and a touch of melancholy as their oldest son navigated the awkwardness of young love. He brought the girl, a sweet-natured blonde named Sarah, to meet them, and she fit into the family with easy grace. "He is so young," Josephine said to Isaac that night. "He is the same age I was when I enlisted, old enough to know his own heart. But what if he gets hurt? Then he will heal, and he will be stronger for it." Isaac pulled her close. "We cannot protect them from everything, love. We can only teach them how to stand back up when they fall." James, meanwhile, was talking about joining the railroad cruise, about seeing California and the Pacific Ocean. Isaac did not forbid it, but he made sure James understood the realities of that kind of life, the dangers and hardships. "If it is still what you want when you are 18, I will not stop you," he said. "But think carefully. The world is bigger and harder than you imagine." Julia declared she wanted to be a doctor, which was met with surprise and then full support from both parents. "Women can be doctors," she insisted, her chin set stubbornly. "I read about it in the newspaper." "Then you will be a doctor," Isaac said firmly. "We will find a way to make it happen." The years moved on, and Isaac and Josephine aged gracefully together. Silver threaded through Isaac's dark hair and beard, and lines formed at the corners of his eyes from years of smiling. Josephine's blonde hair lightened to pale gold, and her hands showed the wear of hard work, but she was still beautiful, still possessed of that quiet grace that had first captured Isaac's attention. Ian married Sarah when he was 19, and they built a cabin on the far edge of Isaac's property with his father's help. It was bittersweet, watching their oldest son start his own life, but it was also joyful. Sarah was a good match for Ian, level-headed and kind, and she loved him with the same depth of feeling that Josephine had for Isaac. James did join the railroad when he turned 18, despite everyone's concerns. He wrote letters home regularly, describing the places he saw and the people he met. His letters were full of adventure and excitement, and though Josephine worried constantly, she knew he was living the life he needed to live. Julia stayed, working as an apprentice to the doctor in Lyndon while studying every medical text she could get her hands on. She was determined and brilliant, and the doctor, who had delivered her and her brothers, was proud to teach her. At 16, she was already assisting with minor procedures, and talk was that she might go to medical college back east in a few years. On a cool autumn evening when Isaac was 52 and Josephine was 49, they sat together on their porch as they had countless times before. Their children were grown or nearly so, their homestead was prosperous, and their love had only deepened with time. "You ever regret it?" Isaac asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Leaving Philadelphia, marrying a rough mountain man and living in the middle of nowhere," Josephine laughed softly. "Not for a single moment. This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted, everything I needed. I was so afraid when I first asked you to marry me, afraid you would say no, afraid I was not good enough for you. You were always good enough, more than good enough." She turned to look at him, this man who had seen her strength when everyone else saw weakness, who had loved her gentleness instead of trying to harden it. "You gave me a life I could never have imagined. You gave me yourself. That was the greatest gift." Isaac kissed her, slow and sweet, the kiss of two people who had spent decades learning every detail of each other and still found new things to love. "I would do it all again, Every moment. So would I. They sat together as the sun set over the Flint Hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The creek sang its eternal song. The grass whispered in the wind. And in the house behind them, lamplight glowed warm through the windows, evidence of the life they had built together. A life that had started with everyone saying Josephine was too meek to survive out west, and Isaac seeing the truth that no one else could see. That gentleness was not weakness, but the truest form of strength. Years continued to pass in a gentle rhythm. Ian and Sarah had 3 children of their own, 2 boys and a girl, who filled the homestead with noise and laughter when they came to visit their grandparents. James eventually returned from his railroad adventures, weathered and wiser, and settled in Lyndon, where he opened a successful freight business. He married a widow with 2 young daughters and became a devoted stepfather. Julia did go to medical college, one of the first women admitted to the program. She studied for 4 years back east, writing long letters home that Josephine and Isaac read aloud to each other by firelight. When she graduated, she returned to Kansas and opened a practice in Lyndon, becoming the first female doctor in the county. The town was skeptical at first, but Julia's skill and dedication won them over, just as Josephine's quiet strength had won over those who doubted her decades earlier. Isaac slowed down as he entered his 60s, his body bearing the accumulated wear of a lifetime of hard physical labor. His hands grew stiff with arthritis, and old war wounds ached in cold weather. But he never complained, adapting his work to match his capabilities, teaching his grandsons the skills he could no longer perform with the same ease. Josephine remained remarkably healthy, her years of hard work on the homestead having built a resilient constitution. She tended her garden with the same careful attention she always had, preserving food for the winter, knitting and sewing for her growing family, and welcoming everyone who came through their door with warmth and generosity. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration at the homestead. All 3 of them came with their families, along with Margaret and Thomas, now elderly themselves, Mrs. Hendricks, who was still spry and sharp-tongued at 78, and dozens of neighbors and friends they had accumulated over the decades. Tables were set up in the yard, laden with food. Children ran and played while adults talked and laughed. Isaac and Josephine sat together in chairs of honor, watching the festivities with quiet contentment. 30 years, Isaac said, shaking his head in wonder. Feels like yesterday you were stitching my ribs in that general store. And you were terrified to ask me to ride up to the hills with you, Josephine added, smiling at the memory. Can you blame me? Most beautiful woman I had ever seen. Most meek, you mean. That is what everyone said. Isaac took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis. They were fools. You were never meek. You were gentle. There is a difference. Ian stood to give a toast, his voice carrying across the yard. To my parents who taught me what real love looks like. Who showed me that strength comes in many forms, and that the best partnerships are built on respect and trust and choosing each other every single day. Thank you for giving us a childhood filled with love and security. Thank you for showing us what it means to build a life worth living. Everyone raised their glasses, and Josephine felt tears slip down her cheeks. These were good tears, tears of overwhelming gratitude and joy. Julia spoke next, her voice clear and confident. Mama, you taught me that I could be gentle and strong at the same time. That being kind was not the same as being weak. Papa, you taught me that men worth knowing are men who see women as equals. You both gave me the courage to pursue my dreams even when the world said they were impossible. I love you both so much. James, ever the emotional one, could barely get through his toast without choking up. You gave me roots and wings. You let me go when I needed to fly and welcomed me home when I needed to land. Everything good in me comes from you both. After the speeches and the toasts, after the food was eaten and the sun began to set, the crowd dispersed. The children played in the meadow chasing fireflies while the adults sat in comfortable clusters, talking and laughing. Isaac and Josephine found themselves alone for a moment on their porch, watching their family enjoy the land they had built a life on. "We did all right," Isaac said quietly. "We did more than all right. We built something beautiful. You are the beautiful thing, Josephine." Everything else just grew from that. She leaned her head against his shoulder, fitting into the curve of his body the way she had for 3 decades. "I love you, Isaac Xander, more now than the day I married you. And I love you, Josephine Xavier, more with every breath I take." They sat together as darkness fell, and the stars came out as their family laughed and talked around them, as the night sounds of the prairie rose in their familiar chorus. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of purpose and meaning, who had proven that the qualities the world dismissed as weakness, gentleness, kindness, patience were actually the foundation of the deepest strength. In the years that followed, as Isaac's health slowly declined, Josephine cared for him with the same tender devotion she had shown her father, but this time tempered with joy rather than grief. He remained sharp and engaged, spending hours telling stories to his grandchildren, passing on the wisdom of his years. When Isaac died at 68, it was peacefully in his sleep, in the bed he had shared with Josephine for 35 years. She was holding his hand, had felt the moment his breathing stopped and his spirit slipped away. The grief was enormous, a tearing pain that threatened to undo her. But she did not break. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Isaac had become, without ever seeking it, a pillar of the community. Men spoke of his fairness and his strength. Women spoke of his gentleness and his devotion to his family. The preacher spoke of a life well lived, of a man who had found his purpose and pursued it faithfully. Josephine stood at the graveside, flanked by her children and grandchildren, and said her private goodbye to the man who had seen her when no one else could, who had loved her gentleness, cherished her strength, and spent every day of their marriage proving that he treasured her. She lived another 15 years after Isaac passed, remaining active and engaged. She moved into town to be closer to Julia's medical practice, occupying a small cottage with a garden that became legendary. Her grandchildren visited constantly, bringing their own children as the years passed, and Josephine welcomed them all with the same grace and warmth she had always possessed. She told them stories about their grandfather, about the mountain man who had lived alone in the hills until he met a gentle woman from Philadelphia, about how love could transform lives, how strength came in unexpected forms, how gentleness was a superpower that the world too often overlooked. When Josephine died at 84, surrounded by 3 generations of family in Julia's house, her last words were a smile and a whisper. "I am coming, Isaac. Wait for me." She was buried beside him on a hilltop overlooking the Flint Hills, where the prairie grass grew tall and golden, and the wind sang its eternal song. Her gravestone, placed next to his, bore a simple inscription chosen by her children. Josephine Barrett Xavier, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was gentle, and that was her greatest strength, and beneath it, added later by her great-grandchildren who wanted the whole story told. They said she was too meek to survive out west. The mountain man knew better. The homestead remained in the family, passed down through the generations. The cabin was preserved, expanded over the years, but maintaining its original heart. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren grew up there, playing in the same creek where Ian and James had skipped stones, picking wildflowers from the same meadow where Julia had chased butterflies. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the hills in shades of orange and gold, people swore they could feel it. The presence of two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built something lasting from gentleness and strength, who had proven that love, real, deep, enduring love, was the greatest adventure of all. Their story became legend in Lyndon and the surrounding country. The meek girl from Philadelphia who had survived and thrived. The mountain man who had found his heart in the last place he expected. Two people who understood that gentleness was not weakness but the highest form of courage. And their legacy lived on, not just in the land and buildings they had left behind, but in the values they had instilled in their children and grandchildren. To see strength in unexpected places. To value kindness as highly as capability. To understand that the gentlest hearts often house the bravest souls. In the general store in Lyndon, now run by Mrs. Hendrick's great-grandson, a framed photograph hung on the wall. It showed a small woman with kind eyes and a giant of a man with a gentle smile, standing together on a porch with 3 children clustered around them. Below it, a small plaque read, Isaac and Josephine Xander, proof that the best stories start with someone seeing what others miss, and it was true. Their story had started with Isaac seeing past Josephine's quiet exterior to the strength within. With Josephine seeing past Isaac's rough edges to the gentle heart beneath. Two people who had understood, instinctively and completely, that the world's definitions of strength and weakness were too simple, too limited. They had lived their truth, built their life, raised their family, and left a legacy that endured long after they were gone. A legacy of love and respect, and the radical belief that gentleness was not just acceptable but admirable. That in a hard land and a harsh time, the choice to remain kind was the bravest choice of all. And so their story ended where it began, in the Flint Hills of Kansas, where the grass grew golden and the wind sang free, where a mountain man and a gentle woman had found each other and built something that would last forever. Not just in memory, but in the lives they had touched, the children they had raised, the love they had shared. They said she was too meek to survive out west. The mountain man had seen gentleness as strength, not weakness, and in seeing her truly, he had loved her completely. And together, they had proved that the doubters were wrong, that love was stronger than hardship, that gentleness could not just survive but flourish in even the hardest places. Their story lived on, told and retold, a reminder that the best love stories are not about changing who you are, but about finding someone who sees who you are and loves you for it. Someone who understands that your perceived weaknesses might actually be your greatest strengths. Someone who chooses you, every day, for exactly who you are. Isaac and Josephine Xander had found that in each other, and in finding it, they had built something beautiful and lasting. A love story for the ages, set against the wild Kansas prairie, proving that sometimes the meek do not just inherit the earth, they transform it.